Welcome. Thank you. Welcome to another and a really very special edition of the Macedon podcast. As you can hear in the beginning, that's the theme of the movie The Batman Mask of the Phantasm. Funny fact is that I used to be a DJ, and what you just heard used to be my intro on many of my shows, especially those in which I was playing heavy bass music. Hi, my name is Marcel Macedon Cruz, and welcome to another edition of the Macedon podcast, but a really special edition. Why? Because this is Batman Week. And if you don't know who Batman is, strap in, because we're gonna cover some basic facts that you should already know by many repeated sequences, and funny facts that many people don't know. For example, that I'm kind of a hardcore Batman fan, as I explained earlier. That was my intro when I was a DJ. Right now, in my car, in the driver's seat, I have a cover for that seat, and guess what? It's a Batman cover. But why is The Dark Knight perhaps in a pantheon of infinite heroes? And me as a comic book fan, that I do not strap myself only to the Marvel DC canon. I go way beyond that. I've seen, for example, I have been a fan of Spawn. I've been a fan of Vertigo Comics, especially the Sandman imprint, which is in a way a DC imprint in sorts. And you got this huge pantheon of superheroes with lots of power. Let's take, for example, Superman, actually a living god amongst men in his own mythos. But what makes Batman special is the fact that, first to start off, he has been a character for 81 years. Last year, Batman made a milestone of being one of the longest running superheroes in the comics pantheon as well as in American culture. And I could say even world culture as itself, because Batman is a really huge phenomenon. But let's start with basics. Why are we celebrating Batman Week? Why are we openly celebrating? First of all, for those of you who have no idea, or just have a maybe mild idea of who Batman is, let's give you a quick run-up, okay? So, Batman is a fictional superhero appearing in American comic books published by DC Comics. The character was created by artist Bob Kane and writer Bill Finger. I want to stop there because there's an important part there. The person who conceived the first Batman suit was Bob Kane, who actually started writing these stories. The first background that we know, Bruce Wayne goes into Crime Alley. Then after he leaves in Crime Alley, his parents get mugged, they get killed in front of him, and that's his call of justice. But the thing is that that beginning, which is constantly being repeated over and over in many movies, but it's because of the same thing that I'm doing here. Because you need an explanation why a billionaire decided to become a vigilante, right? But who wrote that story is not Bob Kane, and it is really common for people to make that mistake that it was Bob Kane, the one who wrote. No, Bob Kane is the one who drew Batman for the first time, but he plays a really important role because Bill Finger could have written this for any kind of hero, say for example even Daredevil, right? And it doesn't have to be a billionaire, but the embodiment, the bat symbol, the cowl itself that is still being used today is the design of Bob Kane. So Bob Kane has a really important role, but he's not the only sole creator of Batman. And there has been properties who credit him as such, and sometimes they don't credit Bill Finger enough. So let's keep going. And it first appeared in Detective Comics number 27 in 1939, which was around this date. It will be 81 years exactly in September 19. You're hearing this on September 17. So it has been around for over 81 years. One of the longest running heroes in American culture. Originally named the Batman, The character is also referred to such epithets as the Cape Crusader, the Dark Knight, and the world's greatest detective, which I'm gonna get later on. Well, as I was mentioning early on, so all right, just reading some of the stuff that is coming. So Batman's secret identity is Bruce Wayne, who is a wealthy American playboy philanthropist and the owner of Wayne Enterprise, which is the part on which Batman gets all of his toys, right? And one important part is that Batman operates in the fictional Gotham City, which, depending on which vision you ask, sometimes could be a little bit reminiscent of London, because sometimes it's a little bit reminiscent of a mixture between Chicago and Los Angeles, Chicago and New York in the same time. But it's mostly, when you look at and you think about Gotham City, you have to think a lot on mostly New York. Even though it draws a lot of inspirations on Chicago and the way the criminals work, but the whole symbolism, if you watch every iteration between the comics, the animated movies, the real life action movies, you will see that Gotham, and that's something that is really important on the Christopher Nolan trilogy, that he makes Gotham comes to life. And the thing is, in the Gotham trilogy, it comes a little bit on its own, but it always has been this hybrid between New York, London, mostly. Why London? Because when you see a lot, when we get closer looks to the streets of Gotham, it gets these old buildings, and it was also reprised in this way. It is like a metropolis that was developing way too fast, and then it got strangled within itself. That's why it is kind of a crime-ridden hellhole for most of the time. But the thing is that for many years, and especially when the Tim Burton versions of the hero came out, it kind of resembled more of a London Gothic noir on the 30s look. But then it eventually developed with the addition of more story into the Batman mythos. So you got different versions of the Dark Knight. When it started, it was kind of a detective comics, so we speak. Detective comics was not mostly made for children. They were, even though they draw the attention of children, but they were kind of more leaning into the more perhaps pre-teenager years, more of a not only a kid. You got products like Superman for that, but what they try to do with Batman, and when you see the comics, let's say for example, in the first comic in which the Joker appeared, he died. He was actually killed by Batman. So the first iteration of Batman is a Batman that kills. It doesn't matter. He doesn't have the moral code that we know now, that he refrains himself from killing because he knows is a path that he's gonna follow. It is funny because the first Batman, we're talking about the Batman that was conceived in 1939, wasn't much. He had his gadgets, but he wasn't fully developed. What Bob Kane and Bill Finger came up was with the character itself. So as for Batcar, he drove his own personal car. For the Batbuild, he got some rope, and I think at one point, if I'm not mistaken, he even had a gun in the beginning. But then as the comics industry became bigger, and most of the DC Comics characters were leaning on to kids' side, this is when you have the Gold Age, and then you have the different ages of comics. So the Joker was revived, so to take back the damage of this killing figure and make him here more of a more of an aggressive vigilante throughout the 60s and 70s. The Joker that we got from that era was kind of more of a prankster, more of the psychopath that we know today. So it was like one of many of the characters of many of Batman's rogues gallery, right? So when we get to the Silver Age, there was a couple of interesting characters that came up in that era, and it was one of them particularly was Ra's al Ghul, which gave a little bit more of an expansion to the Batman mythos. And you see, and I want to make a small parenthesis here, it is really important to note the fact that that Batman is a work of collaboration throughout many years. So let's say Bob Kane and Bill Finger, what they did was conceiving the character. The different facts that we know about Batman were given to him by other writers, and one especially that it is Frank Miller, which I will be getting shortly enough. But throughout the 70s, it was the Silver and Bronze Ages. The Golden Age, it was when it was conceived. It was the character in his natural form. In fact, he had a couple of movies back in the 40s and beginning of the 50s. They were black and white, and they were mostly noir movies. But instead of a detective, we get a guy dressed as a bat, who happens to be a billionaire, who doesn't want to do nothing more than beat up criminals. So that's the Batman for the Golden Age. Throughout the Silver and Bronze Ages, in which he was refrained from killing, the comics were way less violent of what they became throughout the 70s and the 80s. So the 60s version of Batman is basically what the show was about. Many people ask themselves, how could a character that was so campy throughout the 60s become this dark, towering badass that we have known throughout time? And the thing is that, and to note, this is really important, by the time the 60s came, already the first person who made the first actor who was Batman, it was Lewis Wilson, and it was followed by Robert Lowery. And it was around the 1940s, as I explained earlier. And then it was Adam West, which is the version of the TV show, which most people, by that time, as I remember, as I said, the DC Comics was mostly aimed to teenagers. They weren't so on the Marvel side. Marvel was mostly aimed for kids, but it started developing its characters. It started adding dimensions to these characters, right? So when we go back and we